What happens when a judge who has spent decades unfairly sentencing black defendants is suddenly confronted with the truth by a 19-year-old attorney he thought was just another reckless teenager? What secrets lie hidden in his courtroom, and how deep does the corruption go? When justice fights back, who really holds the power? Watch till the end to see how the tables turn. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and support our channel for more powerful stories. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation, a low hum of voices barely contained by the heavy oak walls. The air was thick, not just with tension, but with something more insidious: expectation. Expectation that today's case, like so many before it, would follow the same predictable script. Judge Walter Kensington sat high above the room, perched on his bench like a king surveying his domain. His reputation preceded him. 30 years on the bench had solidified his unshakable authority, and his long-standing history of biased rulings against black defendants was an open secret. Yet, as was always the case, no one ever did anything about it. At the center of today's proceedings stood Zara Whitmore, 19 years old, black, slim but with a posture that spoke of quiet resilience. She wore a simple navy blouse and black slacks, clothes that didn't scream rebellion but also didn't scream deference. Her curls were neatly tied back, revealing sharp, watchful eyes that took in everything, missing nothing. She stood behind the defense table, hands clasped loosely in front of her. Not fidgeting, not panicking, just waiting. Across from her, the prosecutor, Ethan Caldwell, barely looked up from his notes as he mechanically recited the charges. The defendant, Zara Whitmore, is charged with obstructing police business, resisting arrest, and disorderly conduct. She refused a lawful order from an officer on the night of. His voice droned on, devoid of any urgency, as if he were reading a grocery list instead of announcing the fate of a young woman. From the back of the courtroom, a few spectators chuckled, murmuring among themselves. It wasn't hard to see why. This wasn't a case that would make headlines. It was just another black teenager facing the wrath of the system. Another routine conviction waiting to happen. At least, that's what they thought. Judge Kensington let out a bored sigh, adjusting his glasses before finally casting his first real look at Zara. His thin lips curled slightly, his expression one of barely concealed disdain. "Miss Whitmore," he drawled, stretching out her name as though saying it was a waste of his time. "Let me guess, you're going to tell me this is all one big misunderstanding." Zara said nothing. Kensington smirked. He had seen this 1,000 times before. Some young kid, usually black, usually from the wrong side of town, standing in front of him, pleading their case. It was always the same. Always. "Tell me, Miss Whitmore," Kensington continued, leaning forward slightly. "At what point did you decide that listening to a police officer wasn't worth your time? Because I have to tell you, it seems like you've made a habit of ignoring authority." A few more chuckles from the audience. A smirk from one of the officers near the door, the same officer who had arrested her. Zara remained still. Kensington let out a dramatic sigh, shaking his head. "You know, I see a lot of young people come through this courtroom," he mused. "And you know what they all have in common?" A long pause, as if he were giving her time to respond. She didn't. "They waste their potential," he finished, "by making stupid decisions." The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate. Zara didn't flinch, but she felt it, the weight of expectation pressing down on her. This was the part where she was supposed to lower her gaze, apologize, look regretful. This was the part where she was supposed to play her role, the remorseful black defendant standing before the mighty white judge, begging for leniency. Instead, she blinked, and then she smiled. A small smile, barely noticeable, but Kensington noticed, and for the first time that morning his smirk faltered. The chuckling stopped, the murmurs faded. Even the prosecutor, still flipping lazily through his files, paused for just a moment, because this wasn't how things usually went. Zara wasn't arguing. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't even flustered. She was waiting. Waiting for something none of them could see coming. Kensington straightened in his chair, eyes narrowing slightly. "Is there something funny, Miss Whitmore?" he asked, his voice no longer quite as casual. Zara finally spoke. "No, Your Honor." Her voice was clear, even, unshaken. And somehow that single sentence, those 3 words, held more power than any defense speech he had ever heard. Kensington's fingers tightened around his gavel. He wasn't sure why, but suddenly this didn't feel like just another case anymore. "Then I suggest you take this seriously," he snapped, the usual amusement in his tone now replaced with something sharper, colder. "Because I can assure you I do." But Zara still wasn't rattled, and that more than anything else unnerved him. "Of course, Your Honor," she replied, still in that same measured tone. "I take this very seriously." She let her words hang in the air, just long enough for him to notice. Then, slowly, she reached for her bag. From the corner of the room, the officers near the door stiffened slightly, their hands hovering near their belts. Kensington's eyes followed her movements carefully, his jaw tightening. "Miss Whitmore, if you think." But Zara wasn't reaching for a weapon. She wasn't reaching for her phone. She was reaching for something else entirely. Something that, in just a few moments, would turn this entire trial on its head. The moment Judge Walter Kensington uttered the words, "How do you plead?" the entire courtroom expected the usual script to unfold. Zara Whitmore was supposed to lower her head, murmur a guilty plea, and hope for mercy from a man who had never shown it to anyone like her. But she didn't. Instead, she reached for her bag. A ripple of unease passed through the room. The officers by the door tensed, their hands subtly inching toward their belts. Kensington's eyes narrowed, his fingers tightening around his gavel. "Miss Whitmore, I highly advise against making any rash decisions," he warned, his voice edged with impatience. Zara didn't look at him. With a calm, deliberate motion, she pulled out a dark blue leather case and placed it on the defense table. For a second, no one reacted. Then, with the same measured movements, she flipped the case open. Inside, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom, was a bar card, a credential issued only to licensed attorneys. An attorney. A 19-year-old attorney. The room froze. The murmurs started softly at first, hushed voices whispering in disbelief. Then they grew, rippling through the courtroom like an electric current. The prosecutor, Ethan Caldwell, who had spent most of the hearing barely paying attention, suddenly sat up straight, flipping frantically through his files. His expression shifted from boredom to panic, his fingers scrambling over his keyboard, searching for any record that could disprove what he had just seen. But he wouldn't find one, because it was real. Judge Kensington, for the first time in a very long time, was at a loss for words. He blinked, then blinked again. His mouth opened as if to speak, then snapped shut. It took a solid 3 seconds for him to regain control of his expression, to force the words out through gritted teeth. "What exactly is the meaning of this?" Zara tilted her head slightly, studying him the way a professor might study a student struggling with a basic concept. "It means, Your Honor," she said, her voice smooth and unwavering, "that I am a licensed attorney." "That's impossible," Kensington snapped, his voice sharp. "You're 19. Zara tapped a perfectly manicured finger against the bar card. "I graduated law school at 18, passed the bar on my first attempt." Her words landed like a hammer, each syllable sending another shockwave through the already stunned courtroom. A reporter in the back reached for their phone, whispering urgently to their colleague. The officers near the door exchanged looks, their smug expressions flickering with uncertainty. Prosecutor Caldwell let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding, his eyes darting from Zara to Kensington. But Zara wasn't done yet. She straightened her posture, looking directly at the judge, her expression unreadable. "And Your Honor," she continued, letting the tension stretch, "I'm not just here as a defendant." She reached into her bag once more. The room held its collective breath. Zara pulled out a slim black folder and placed it beside her bar card. "I'm also here on behalf of a legal watchdog organization." And just like that, the entire case flipped on its head. Kensington's smirk was gone. His face reddened, but his voice was tight, controlled, dangerous. "A stunt," he spat. "This is a pathetic stunt." But his eyes betrayed him. There was something else there now, a flicker of uncertainty. Zara noticed it immediately. She had his attention now. "Is it?" she asked, arching an eyebrow. "Because as of this morning, I have full authorization to conduct a formal review of your courtroom." The whispers in the gallery exploded into full-blown murmurs. One of the court clerks shifted uncomfortably in their seat. Kensington's fingers twitched toward his gavel, but he didn't strike it. Not yet. "This is ridiculous," he barked. "You expect me to believe that someone sent a teenager to investigate me?" Zara didn't blink. "I expect you to recognize that it doesn't matter how old I am," she countered. "It only matters that I am legally licensed to do so." Caldwell, still glued to his laptop, suddenly cleared his throat. All eyes turned to him. The color had drained from his face. "Your Honor," he hesitated, swallowing thickly before finally admitting the truth. "Her credentials check out." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Kensington's jaw clenched. The courtroom was no longer his. Zara had seized control, and he knew it. The judge sat perfectly still, his fingers gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Zara, on the other hand, was the picture of calm. She took a slow step forward, her voice measured, deliberate. "For years, Your Honor, people like me have stood in front of you powerless." She let the words sink in, watching as the judge's face darkened. "But today," she tilted her head, "that changes." The reporters in the back were typing furiously. The court officers shifted uncomfortably. Even the spectators, the ones who had laughed at her earlier, were now silent. For the first time in his career, Judge Walter Kensington wasn't the one holding the gavel, and he knew it. A thick silence hung over the courtroom, pressing against the walls, filling every corner with unspoken tension. The weight of it was almost tangible. Judge Walter Kensington's fingers hovered over his gavel, his knuckles turning white. His courtroom had never felt like this before, like it was slipping from his grasp. At the center of it all stood Zara Whitmore. She was no longer just a defendant. No longer just another young black woman standing before a powerful man who had sentenced hundreds like her without a second thought. Now, she was the one holding the power, and she wasn't about to let it go. With a calm, measured hand, Zara reached for the black folder she had placed on the defense table moments earlier. "Your Honor," she said, her voice smooth and confident, "I'd like to introduce some data into the record." She flipped open the folder, revealing a thick stack of neatly compiled documents. "Over the past 15 years, your courtroom has demonstrated a clear and undeniable pattern of racial bias." A murmur rippled through the audience. Kensington's jaw tightened. "That's absurd," he barked, but Zara was already sliding the first document toward the court clerk. "Is it?" she asked, her voice carrying the quiet force of a wrecking ball. "Because the numbers say otherwise." The court clerk hesitated before picking up the document, his eyes scanning the first few lines. The murmurs grew. Even prosecutor Ethan Caldwell, who had been trying his best to stay out of the direct line of fire, shifted uncomfortably. Zara turned to the audience now, speaking loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let's take a look at two nearly identical cases." She picked up the first document and held it up. Case number 2017-0439. A white college student arrested for public disturbance outside of a bar. Charges: disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. She paused, letting the words settle before continuing. Sentence: charges dismissed. The judge cited. She lifted the page higher, reading it word for word. Youthful indiscretion. A few people in the audience snorted in disbelief. Now let's compare that, Zara continued, to case number 2018-1172. She pulled out the second document and placed it beside the first. A black high school senior, same charge, public disturbance, same circumstances. The difference? She took a deliberate step forward. Judge Walter Kensington sentenced him to 90 days in county jail. The courtroom exploded into shocked gasps. "That's a lie," Kensington snapped, his voice sharp, but his eyes flickered toward the document as if afraid to look too closely. "It's not," Zara replied coolly. "It's all here. Would you like me to continue?" She reached for the next document. Kensington gritted his teeth. "Enough." "Why?" Zara asked, her tone deceptively casual. "Because you don't want to hear the numbers." She turned to the audience, the press, the onlookers who had come expecting a routine trial and were now witnessing something far bigger. Over the past 15 years, black defendants in Judge Kensington's courtroom have received, on average, twice the sentencing as white defendants for the same charges. The whispers in the courtroom grew into full conversations. Reporters scribbled furiously, some reaching for their phones. Even the officers standing by the door shifted uncomfortably. Kensington's grip on his gavel tightened. "This is outrageous," he spat. "You're twisting numbers to fit your agenda." Zara's smile was razor-sharp. "Am I?" She flipped to another page, holding it up. "Let's talk about possession charges." She tapped the document lightly. "A white defendant, first-time offense, possession of marijuana, your sentence, probation." She pulled out another. "A black defendant, same charge, first-time offense, your sentence." She let the moment stretch. 3 years in prison." A low whistle came from the back of the room. Even Caldwell, who had been staring at his screen like it might offer an escape, finally looked up. "Your Honor," he started, his voice oddly hesitant. Kensington snapped his gaze toward him. Not another word. But the damage was already done. Zara wasn't finished. "Your Honor," she said, her voice as steady as ever. "If the numbers aren't enough, let's talk about precedent." She reached into her folder one last time and pulled out a Supreme Court ruling. Texas v. Johnson, 1989. The name landed like a hammer. The Supreme Court ruled that verbal challenges to police officers do not constitute obstruction unless they physically interfere with law enforcement actions. She let that sink in before she leaned forward slightly. "I asked a question. That's all I did." "I asked, what's the charge?" Her voice was calm, but the entire room could feel the storm behind it. "That's not obstruction, Your Honor." She let the words hang in the air. Kensington had no response. His gavel was still raised, but he hadn't struck it once. Because he knew. Everyone in the room knew. "The law doesn't care about your biases, Judge." Zara's voice dropped slightly, forcing everyone to lean in. "And neither do I." The press erupted, cameras flashing. Caldwell rubbed his temples, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. The officers near the door exchanged nervous glances. And Kensington? For the first time since taking the bench decades ago, he looked like a man who had lost all control of his courtroom. The courtroom was on fire. Not in the literal sense, but in the way a place implodes under the weight of truth. Judge Walter Kensington's grip on his gavel had tightened to the point where his knuckles had turned ghostly white. He wanted to slam it down, to reclaim authority, to silence the chaos. But the gavel was useless now, because his courtroom was no longer his. The balance of power had shifted, and Zara Whitmore stood at the center of it all, completely unshaken. "This is ridiculous," Kensington barked, his voice cracking under the weight of the moment. "This so-called evidence, fabricated statistics, cherry-picked cases, it's all a sham." His words sounded hollow even to himself, but he wasn't finished. "Miss Whitmore, you are not a prosecutor, you are not a judge, you are barely an attorney. This is my courtroom." Zara tilted her head slightly, studying him like a scientist examining a specimen under a microscope. "Your courtroom," she repeated, her voice low and deliberate. The murmurs in the gallery swelled, and a few people laughed softly, the absurdity of his statement sinking in. Zara placed both hands on the table, leaning forward slightly. "No, Your Honor, this courtroom belongs to the law, and today—" a small smile flickered across her lips. "The law caught up with you." And then she delivered the final blow. With the ease of someone who had rehearsed this moment, Zara reached into her bag one last time. The room held its collective breath. Slowly, she pulled out a sealed manila envelope, thick with official-looking documents, and set it on the table. "This," she said, tapping the folder lightly, "is a formal notice from the Federal Judicial Ethics Committee." Kensington's breath hitched. "What?" Zara flipped the folder open, revealing a printed statement bearing the official seal of the FJEC. "As of last month," she continued, "the committee launched an investigation into your courtroom rulings. Complaints have been filed, data has been analyzed, witnesses have come forward." Kensington staggered back in his chair as if the words had physically struck him. No, this is a misunderstanding." Zara lifted a single printed sheet and held it up for the room to see. "This is an official report highlighting the disproportionate sentencing in your court." She pulled out another document. "This one lists the names of black defendants who received harsher punishments for first-time offenses, while white defendants in similar cases walked free." She placed them down one by one. "And this," she lifted the final document, "this is a petition signed by over a dozen civil rights attorneys and former defendants demanding your immediate suspension." The murmurs erupted into full-blown chaos, and then the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Two men in dark suits stepped inside. They moved with deliberate precision, their presence cutting through the chaos like a knife. The air shifted, as if the very structure of the courtroom had changed. One of them, a tall man with graying hair and a hardened expression, stepped forward and pulled a badge from his pocket. "Judge Walter Kensington," he announced, "by order of the Federal Judicial Ethics Committee, you are hereby placed on immediate suspension pending further investigation." The room imploded. "No," Kensington choked out, you can't do this." But no one was listening. The press went wild, cameras flashing, reporters furiously typing updates into their phones. Federal agents just walked into the courtroom. "Judge Kensington is being suspended on the spot. This is historic." Spectators who had once been silent observers were now cheering. The courtroom that had once belonged to Walter Kensington was turning against him in real time. The officers by the door, the same ones who had mocked Zara earlier, now looked uneasy, glancing at each other, unsure whether they should keep standing there or just leave. Prosecutor Ethan Caldwell, who had spent the entire trial trying to stay neutral, finally broke his silence. "Your Honor," Caldwell said, his voice strangely steady now, "the prosecution officially withdraws all charges against Miss Whitmore." Kensington's head snapped up. "What?" Caldwell didn't look at him. He was looking at Zara now. And there was something different in his eyes. Maybe it was respect, maybe it was fear, maybe it was recognition that he had just witnessed something far bigger than a single case. "Your Honor," Caldwell continued, "in light of recent developments and clear judicial misconduct, the state has no interest in pursuing this case further." No, you don't get to do this." Kensington was practically frothing at the mouth now, his face turning red, his composure completely gone. But no one was listening. The federal agents moved in, stepping up to the bench. "Judge Kensington," the lead agent said, his voice calm but firm. "Please step down from the bench." Kensington looked around desperately, as if searching for someone, anyone, to back him up. But the officers weren't moving. The press was still typing furiously. The spectators were whispering, recording, watching. And Zara, she was just standing there, watching him the same way he had watched countless defendants crumble under his rulings. Kensington pushed himself up from his chair, his hands shaking. "This is a mistake," he muttered. "I served this court for 30 years. This is a witch hunt." A woman from the gallery laughed dryly. "Tell that to my brother," she called out. "He's still sitting in jail for the same charge you dismissed for a white college kid." A wave of agreement swept through the crowd. Kensington couldn't even respond. As the federal agents led him toward the exit, the reality sank in. He wasn't the one in control anymore. This wasn't his courtroom anymore. And Zara Whitmore had just made history. The courthouse doors swung open, and a flood of noise crashed into Zara Whitmore like a tidal wave. The moment she stepped outside, reporters swarmed, their voices overlapping in a frenzy of questions, their cameras flashing so rapidly that it felt like a strobe light. "Miss Whitmore, how does it feel to take down a sitting judge? Did you know about the investigation before today? Was this your plan all along? Do you think this will lead to more judges being held accountable?" The crowd pressed forward, microphones thrust toward her face, cameras capturing every angle of the woman who had just dismantled Walter Kensington's career in real time. But Zara, she stood firm. Her posture was steady, her expression unreadable. She could feel the weight of it all settling on her shoulders, the power, the consequences, the sheer magnitude of what had just happened. She had walked into that courthouse a defendant. She had walked out a symbol of justice, and she wasn't about to let anyone twist the narrative. Raising a hand, she silenced the crowd with nothing but her presence. The questions died down, the flashes slowed, and in a single breath she reclaimed control of the moment. "I didn't do this for fame." Her voice was strong, unwavering, cutting through the chaos like a blade. "I did this for justice." A hush settled over the crowd. And then the first cheer rang out, then another, and another, until the whole crowd erupted into applause. As the noise surged around her, Zara's phone buzzed in her pocket. It was so subtle, so easy to miss amidst the chaos. But for some reason, she felt it like a warning sign. Slipping her hand into her pocket, she pulled out her phone and glanced at the screen. Unknown number, and just below it a text message: "We need to talk. I have something you'll want to see." Zara's heart skipped a beat. Her grip on the phone tightened, her mind already racing. She hadn't given her number to anyone new recently. Whoever this was, they had found her. The timing was too perfect. Her gut instinct, the same instinct that had guided her through law school, through trials, through the chaos of today's courtroom battle, told her one thing with absolute certainty: this isn't over. She looked up, scanning the faces around her, searching for anyone watching her too closely, anyone out of place. Nothing. But she knew better than to assume she was alone. Zara's mind replayed everything that had led up to this moment. Kensington's downfall. It wasn't random. It wasn't just one bad judge getting exposed. The data she had compiled, the years of disproportionate sentencing, the clear racial bias, it wasn't just about Kensington. It was systemic. And if someone had been watching her, tracking her, waiting until now to reach out, that could only mean one thing. There was more corruption, more judges, more lives destroyed by a system designed to keep people like her at a disadvantage. She had thought winning today's battle would bring peace. But instead, it had opened a door to something much, much bigger. And someone, somewhere, was about to show her just how deep this went. Zara exhaled, gripping the phone a little tighter. She had a choice. She could walk away right now, let the headlines call this her victory, let the world move on while she returned to a normal life. Or she could step forward into the unknown, into a fight that no one else was willing to take on. She glanced at the reporters still watching her, waiting for more words, more answers. She said nothing. Instead, she turned away, walking toward her car, her phone still in her hand, her mind already made up. Because Zara Whitmore had never been the kind of person to walk away from the truth, and she wasn't about to start now. Zara Whitmore's battle against Judge Kensington was never just about one case. It wasn't about proving her own innocence or even about exposing one corrupt judge. It was about holding power accountable, about challenging a system designed to silence people like her. Her story is a testament to a greater truth. Justice isn't something that is simply given. It has to be fought for, demanded, and defended, even when the odds seem impossible. The power of knowledge. Zara's greatest weapon wasn't strength or connections. It was her intelligence, her research, and her unwavering belief in the law. She understood that knowledge is power, and when armed with the truth, even the most entrenched institutions can be dismantled. Corruption thrives in silence for years. Kensington operated without consequence, his biases ruining countless lives because no one dared to challenge him. But Zara proved that one voice, armed with evidence and courage, is enough to shake an entire system. The fight for justice is ongoing. Taking down Kensington wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The moment Zara received that mysterious message, it became clear that corruption isn't confined to a single courtroom. Justice is not a destination. It's a continuous fight that demands vigilance, resilience, and sacrifice. Change comes from those who refuse to back down. Zara could have played along with the system. She could have pleaded guilty, accepted her fate, and moved on. But she didn't. She stood her ground, knowing that the truth matters, even when it makes people uncomfortable. The lesson here: never assume that something is too big to change. Never believe that injustice is too deeply rooted to be uprooted. The system only holds power because people let it. And when someone like Zara stands up, refuses to be silenced, and demands accountability, change becomes inevitable. Because justice doesn't just happen, it's made.